My name is Tori. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a home health nurse. The day after the earthquake took my apartment, my mother stood in her doorway. A doorway I'd had a key to for 18 years, and told me there was no space for my 8-year-old daughter. Not, "We're full." Not, "Give us a week." She looked at Ellie, then at me, and said, "Only without the child." I didn't argue. I didn't plead on her porch. I said, "Fine." And I walked my daughter back to the car. But here's what none of them knew. I had spent 18 years being useful to that house. The gutters, the taxes, the pill organizers, and what I did over the next 3 days made my mother stand in her own kitchen at 2 in the morning, pressing that same house key into my hand, begging me to take it back. What happened on the third night, after the ground moved a second time, I'm still not sure any of us walked away from it the same. If stories about standing your ground with the people who share your blood hit home for you, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. Because this one starts with a locked door and ends with a key nobody would pick up. The earthquake hit on a Tuesday at 4:17 in the afternoon, the last week of September. I was changing a wound dressing on a patient's leg out on Route 12 when the floor rolled under my knees like a boat wake. Magnitude 6.4, they said later. In Cedar Wells, California, that's not a number. That's every dish you own on the kitchen floor. I taped the dressing down, told my patient to stay in her chair, and drove to Cedar Wells Elementary with my hands steadier than they had any right to be. Nursing does that to you. Panic is a luxury for people who aren't holding the gauze. Ellie was on the soccer field with her class, clutching her backpack, and when she saw me, she didn't run. She walked fast, chin up, the way she does when she's decided not to scare me. 8 years old and already managing my feelings. We drove to our apartment on Mercer Street and stood on the sidewalk looking up. The building was standing. The wall wasn't right. There was a crack running from the second-floor window down through the brick like a signature, and our unit was on the second floor. A fireman waved everyone back and said nobody sleeps inside tonight. So we slept in the Honda. Ellie curled in the back seat under my work fleece, her box of collected rocks tucked under her arm like a stuffed animal. I sat in the front and did what I do on hard shifts. Triage, airway, breathing, shelter. We were alive, we were together, and in the morning a city inspector was going to walk up to our door with a roll of colored tags, and the color he chose would decide our whole year. The tag was red, not yellow, which means limited entry. Red, which means the building can kill you, which means 15 minutes inside with an escort and a flashlight to take what you can carry. I've packed for emergencies my whole career, so I didn't waste my 15 minutes standing still in the hallway. I took Ellie's rock box, her school clothes, my scrubs, our documents folder, and the framed photo of Ellie at the beach when she was 2. The inspector was kind. He said, "Ma'am, you're calmer than most." I said, "Give me time." Then I sat in the car and made calls. 11 hotels between Cedar Wells and the interstate. 11 versions of the same sentence. Booked solid, utility crews, insurance adjusters, 1,200 families with tags on their doors just like mine. FEMA's hotel program takes days to switch on after a declaration. The woman on the helpline was gentle about it, which somehow made it worse. My coworker Jen had a couch, but Jen also had a yellow tag, a mother-in-law, and 3 dogs in a 2-bedroom. I kept my voice easy for Ellie's sake, and worked the list like a med chart, line by line. Nothing. The sun started dropping and the gym at Cedar Wells High opened as a Red Cross shelter, and I felt the word coming before my daughter said it, the way you feel a fever coming in a patient's eyes. Ellie leaned between the seats and asked, "Are we going to Grandma's?" Simple question. 2 miles east, 4 bedrooms, a porch swing, a woman who irons her dish towels. And something in my chest pulled tight like a suture, because the honest answer to my daughter's simple question was complicated in a way no 8-year-old should ever have to learn. My parents' house came through the quake the way my mother comes through everything, undented and certain of itself. Ray and Carol Atkins, 214 Linden Court. Chimney straight, windows whole, the flag out front barely crooked. I parked in the driveway I learned to ride a bike on, and for 1 weak second I let myself imagine it. Ellie in my old room. Pancakes. A door that locks between my daughter and the cold. I knocked. My mother answered in her good cardigan, because even in a disaster Carol Atkins dresses for the neighbors. Her eyes went to Ellie first. I watched it happen. The flick, the assessment, the little closing behind her face like a shop pulling its shutter. Then she looked at me. Tori, thank God you're all right. I said the apartment was red tagged, that we needed a place for a while, a week, maybe 2. My mother glanced back into the house, at all that space, and then she said it, in the same tone she uses to decline a second helping. You can have your old room, only without the child. There's no space for her. No space for her. In a 4-bedroom house with a sewing room nobody sews in. Behind her, at the end of the hall, my father stood half in shadow with a dish towel in his hands, and he looked at me, and he said nothing at all. My daughter was 10 feet away, watching through the windshield, reading lips the way kids read everything we think we're hiding. I didn't beg. Begging was for a version of me that still believed this door had a price I could pay. I said, fine. Just that. I walked back to the car on steady legs, buckled my seatbelt like it was any Tuesday, and started the engine. Ellie was quiet until the stop sign at the end of Linden Court. Then, in a voice she kept very small, she asked, Mommy, what did Grandma mean? Here's what my mother meant, and it did not start that afternoon. Ellie was born in March, 8 years ago, at Mercy Regional, 6 pounds even. Her father, Cole, had been gone since the 5th month. A roofer with a good laugh and a bad habit of leaving, and I've made my peace with that. My parents never did, though it wasn't him they blamed. It was the paperwork. No ring, no wedding, no story my mother could tell at First Baptist without lowering her voice. She came to the hospital exactly once. She stood on the far side of the nursery glass, looked at her granddaughter for the length of one long breath, and did not ask to hold her. After that, the rules arrived quietly, the way rules do in my family. Never announced, just enforced. Sunday dinner, standing invitation, 1 chair. Come alone, sweetheart, it's easier. Christmas cards addressed to Tori Atkins, singular. 8 birthdays, and not one gift with my daughter's name on it, though my mother never once forgot mine. I used to test the fence lines. I'd bring Ellie to the door at Easter and watch my mother produce a headache. I'd mention a school play and watch my father check a watch he wasn't wearing. It wasn't rage. Rage would have been easier to fight. It was policy. Smooth, polite, unanimous, enforced by silence. So no, the doorstep didn't shock me. The earthquake just did what earthquakes do. It found the crack that was already in the building and made it visible from the street. What I still couldn't explain, not to Ellie, not even to myself that night, was why, for 8 years of 1-chair invitations, I had kept showing up at that house with my toolbox. Because here's the part I'm not proud of. For 8 years, I was that house's maintenance plan. When the gutters clogged, I climbed the ladder. When Dad's taxes got complicated after he retired from the electric co-op, I sat at their kitchen table with the forms and a calculator while Ellie stayed with a sitter I paid for. I sorted my mother's heart pills into a Sunday through Saturday organizer every month, because that's what nurse daughters do. And in my sock drawer, in a fat envelope marked roof, I had $4,800, 3 years of skipped haircuts and picked up shifts, because their shingles were curling and my father wouldn't spend the money, and I'd decided I would fix it before the winter rains. Nobody asked me to. That's the disease if you want the clinical picture. I believed, somewhere under the scrubs, that if I stayed useful long enough, the bill would finally come due in my favor. That one Sunday there'd just be 2 chairs, no discussion, the way rules relax for people who've earned it. My patient Marge Hollis saw it before I did. Marge is 71, a widow with a stubborn heart and a 12-acre farm north of town, and I'd been checking her vitals 3 evenings a week for 3 years. Twice she'd offered me the empty apartment over her garage, her son's, before he moved to Phoenix. Twice I'd said no, smiling, using Ellie as the excuse. Better to stay close to my folks. Even that week, with my whole life in a red-tagged building, the words felt safer than the truth. That refusal was the most expensive sentence I ever said, and I would learn the price of it within 72 hours. The shelter at Cedar Wells High smelled like floor wax and instant coffee. Green cots in rows under the basketball banners, 100 and some people trying to be polite about snoring. Ellie claimed a cot by the wall and lined her rocks up on the pillow, smallest to largest, her own kind of triage. I did what I always do in a room full of need. I found the volunteer table and put my hands to work, passing out water bottles and checking on the diabetics, because sitting still with my thoughts felt more dangerous than any aftershock. I printed my name on the volunteer list, big block letters, Atkins. Around 9, Susan Pratt came through with boxes of donated blankets. The pastor's wife, 58, kind eyes, the sort of woman who knows everyone's casserole dish by sight. She spotted Ellie's cot, then me, and I watched her do arithmetic she was too polite to say out loud. Tori Atkins, she said carefully. Aren't Ray and Carol just 2 miles out on Linden? I said. They are. I kept my face level and my voice level, and I offered nothing else, because I was raised to keep family business behind the fence, and some training dies hard. Susan patted my arm and moved on with her blankets. But I felt it, the small click of a gear turning somewhere in the machinery of this town. In Cedar Wells, who sleeps where after a disaster is public record written in cots, and my mother's name was now attached to 2 of them. I lay down next to my daughter and stared at the rafters and wondered, without much pity, which of us that machine was going to grind first. I didn't sleep that first night in the shelter. Around midnight, I sat up on the cot and took out my keyring and looked at it under the exit sign light. Work key, car key, mailbox key that now opened a mailbox for a condemned building. And the brass one, worn smooth at the shoulder, the key to 214 Linden Court, on my ring since I was 16. I'd used it 1,000 times, and almost never for myself. Let myself into water plants when they drove to Fresno. Let myself in to leave soup during Dad's shingles. Let myself in, last spring, to fix the garbage disposal while they were at church, so my mother could come home to a working sink and no obligation to say thank you. 18 years of that key, and my daughter had never once slept behind the door it opened. I looked at Ellie, sleeping with one hand on her rock box, and I thought about the promise I'd made her in the hospital when she was 1 day old and the visitor chair was empty. She will never feel like a guest in her own family. I had kept that promise everywhere except the one place it mattered most, and the earthquake had just put the failure in writing. So, in the dark, in a gym that smelled like other people's hard luck, I opened the envelope marked roof and counted it by feel. 4,800. Money I'd saved to hold their house together. In the morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first one, my mother would hear about within the hour. The second one, she wouldn't understand the full size of until the 3rd night. And that was the call that ended everything. The second call, the quiet one, was to Marge Hollis at 7 in the morning, before I could talk myself out of it. Marge, is the apartment still empty? There was a pause, and then that dry voice of hers. Been empty 2 years, hasn't grown legs. You finally asking? I was finally asking. We did it properly because I don't take favors I can't stand under. First month, last month, and a deposit. $4,800. The whole envelope. And on top of that, I'd take over her evening care off the clock. Vitals and meds, trade and barter, farm rules. Marge said, I'd have taken less. I said, I know. That's why it's the full amount. She laughed like a screen door and told me the key would be under the geranium pot, which is Marge for welcome home. The first call was to my supervisor, asking for my banked week of leave. And here's the thing about small towns. By 8:30, the machinery I'd heard clicking the night before had already turned once. Susan Pratt, doing shelter intake, had mentioned to the prayer chain, kindly, the way knives are sometimes kind, that poor Tori Atkins and her little girl had spent the night on cots at the high school. And the prayer chain runs straight through my mother's kitchen. When I picked Ellie up off that cot, She asked where we were going, and I knelt down to her level the way I do with scared patients and told her the truth. We're going to a farm. We're renting our own place. She studied me with those brown eyes. Because Grandma has no space? And I said the sentence I want on my headstone. Baby, we don't beg for rooms. We build them. I heard about my mother's mourning secondhand, the way you hear about weather in the next county, from my cousin Dana, who still goes to First Baptist and narrates it like play-by-play. Susan Pratt had called my mother out of Christian concern, voice full of blankets. Carol, honey, I saw Tori and the baby at the shelter. Is everything all right? And my mother, who irons her dish towels, did not miss a beat. Oh, the girls are fine. Tori has plenty of options. You know how dramatic this generation gets. It's practically camping over there. Camping. My daughter sleeping on a canvas cot under a scoreboard, a short walk from her grandmother's sewing room, and the official family position was that we were roughing it for fun. Dana asked if I wanted her to say something. I said no, and I meant it. And I want to be clear about why, because this is the part people get wrong about women like my mother. I didn't need to fight her in public. Her whole life was a performance for an audience I didn't perform for anymore. And a performance like that doesn't need an enemy to fail. It just needs time, and one audience member with working eyes. Susan Pratt had working eyes. She had seen the cots herself. So when my mother said plenty of options in that bright hostess voice, something didn't sit right in Susan. The way a wrong lab value doesn't sit right in me, and lies in a town like Cedar Wells are like cracks in a load wall. You can paint them. You can hang a picture over them. But the building knows. And the building always tells. And all I had to do was keep living in plain sight. The city gave me my second escorted entry that afternoon. 15 minutes, one inspector, everything we could carry between us and the neighbors who showed up in pickups without being asked. Mr. Okafor from the deli carried Ellie's mattress on his back like it weighed nothing. Jen came on her lunch break and boxed my kitchen with ER speed. 15 minutes isn't much of a life, but it turns out the parts that matter fit in a truck bed. Beds, books, the good skillet, a rock collection. We were loading the last boxes when I saw the blue Silverado, my father's truck, coming down Mercer Street slower than my father has ever driven anything. Ray Atkins, 67, 40 years with the electric co-op, a man who can rewire a house but not a sentence. He didn't stop. He slowed. Enough for me to see his hand squeezing the wheel at 10 and 2 like it owed him money. Enough to see his eyes go over the mattress and the boxes and his granddaughter holding a lamp. And then he raised 2 fingers off the wheel in that farmer wave, and he drove on. My father waved like a man apologizing through glass. Ellie waved back, because she is 8 and generous and doesn't know yet that a wave can be a coward's signature. Jen watched the truck turn at the light and said one syllable I won't repeat. Me, I filed it. The slowing, the grip, the not stopping. The way I file a symptom that hasn't declared itself yet. Something was moving in my father. Some slow tectonic thing, and I remember thinking, with no idea how literal it would get. Whatever that is, it's going to take a bigger shake to bring it down. Our second night at the shelter was supposed to be our last. The gas company couldn't relight Marge's pilot until morning, quake protocol, no exceptions. And it was the night Ellie spiked a fever. Nothing dramatic, 100.6, the kind of low burn kids run when their whole world has been shaken twice. But the shelter's volunteer nurse had gone home sick herself, so I spent the night doing 2 jobs. Cool cloths for my daughter, blood pressure checks for half the senior citizens in Cedar Wells. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, wringing a washcloth, I heard my mother's voice in my head. Uninvited. Clear as a bell over a church door. There's no space for her. You can be bone-tired and still feel a sentence like that walk up your spine. The woman on the next cot was watching me work. Small, white-haired, sharp-eyed, one of Marge's bridge friends. Ruth, she said her name was. She nodded at Ellie and said, "You're the Atkins girl, the nurse." I said I was. And then she said, easy as commenting on the weather, "Your Aunt Dinah used to sew all my church dresses. Beautiful hands. Shame what that family did to her." I kept wringing the washcloth, but everything in me went still. I don't have an Aunt Dinah. 34 years in this town, every holiday, every funeral, every photo album. There was no Dinah in any of it. Ruth saw my face and closed up like a coin purse, suddenly fascinated by her blanket. I checked Ellie's forehead, cooler now, and lay down with my mind running hot instead. My family had a missing person in it, and I had never even heard her name. I called my mother in the morning from the shelter parking lot, watching Ellie eat a donated muffin in the passenger seat. It was the first time we'd spoken since her doorstep, and I didn't waste it on the doorstep. "Mom, who's Dinah?" The silence on that line had a texture to it, like a room where something just broke and everyone's waiting to see who moves. Then my mother's voice came back with the shutter pulled all the way down. "Where did you hear that name?" "Not who told you? Not that's a sad old story. Where did you hear that name? The way you'd ask about a contamination." I said a woman at the shelter mentioned her. My mother said, "We don't talk about that." With a period on it you could hear. And then, because she is who she is, she pivoted smooth as a hostess. "Susan tells me you've found somewhere. I think that's for the best. Don't you?" For the best. I stood in a parking lot full of other people's donated blankets and almost laughed. My homeless daughter was for the best. My $4,800 was for the best. But I've drawn blood from combative patients. I know when to stop pushing a needle. I said, "Goodbye, Mom," and hung up, and sat with the two facts I now owned. 1. Somewhere out there was a woman named Dinah, family, erased so completely that 34 years of me never bumped into her. 2. Whatever she'd done to earn erasure, an old lady at a shelter called it a shame. Not a scandal, a shame. And shame, in my family, only ever flows one direction. Downhill, onto the women. I had a feeling I already knew the shape of Dinah's crime. We moved into the farm that morning. The apartment over Marge's garage had knotty pine walls, a window over the sink with a view of the north pasture, and 2 bedrooms. 2. And when Ellie understood the second one was hers, she walked its perimeter like a small surveyor and then set her rock box on the windowsill, dead center, with the ceremony of a flag planting. The gas man relit the pilot at 8. Jen's husband and Mr. Okafor had the beds up by 10. By noon, it smelled like coffee and pine sap, and I stood in my own kitchen. Mine, rented, earned, no conditions attached, and I took out my keyring. The brass key to 214 Linden Court. 18 years it had ridden next to my car key, so familiar my thumb knew its teeth blind. I slid it off the ring. It weighed nothing. It weighed everything. I put it in a plain envelope, and I'll tell you what I wrote on the front, because people always assume there was a letter inside. Some speech, some scorched earth goodbye. There was no letter. There was one line on the envelope. "You'll need this more than I will." Marge was driving into town that afternoon for her pharmacy run and her cardiology check, and Marge had been waiting 3 years to be useful to me the way I was useful to everybody. I asked her to put it in Carol Atkins's hand. Not the mailbox. Her hand. Ellie came in while I was sealing it and stopped, because kids can smell a ritual. "Is that Grandma's key?" she asked. "Are we giving it back?" I ran my thumb over the flap one last time. "We're giving back what was never really ours, baby." She thought about that the way she thinks about a new rock, turning it over, checking the weight. Then she nodded and went back to her windowsill. The envelope sat on the counter the rest of the morning, white and quiet, like a tooth pulled clean. That first night in the apartment, I cooked spaghetti in my own skillet on my own stove, and Ellie ate 2 bowls and told me the pasture smelled like horses even though Marge hasn't kept horses in a decade. The quiet out there was a different species from the quiet at my parents' table. Their quiet is a held breath. This one was just quiet. Crickets, the icebox hum, my daughter's fork on a plate. After she fell asleep in her own room, in her own bed, under the fleece she now refused to give back, I sat on the little porch landing at the top of the garage stairs with a cup of tea, and did something I hadn't done since the ground first moved. Nothing. No lists, no calls, no fixing. Down the hill, Marge's kitchen light was on, and I knew her pill organizer was full because I'd filled it. But I'd filled it as a neighbor being paid in shelter and eggs, a square deal between women who respect each other, and the difference between that and 18 years of Linden Court could power the whole valley. If you've ever handed something back that you spent years earning, a key, a name, a place at somebody's table, then you know exactly how that porch felt, and I'd love to hear your version in the comments, truly. And if you're new here, subscribe now. Because that same afternoon, Marge had carried a plain white envelope into town for me, and what my mother did when that key finally landed in her palm, I could not have predicted with 100 guesses. The ground, as it turned out, wasn't finished with any of us either. Marge Hollis carried the envelope into town that Friday afternoon and gave me the full report at her 9 o'clock check that night, while I wrapped the blood pressure cuff around her arm, because Marge narrates like a woman who's been saving up. She'd found my mother at the church, naturally. First Baptist had turned its fellowship hall into a relief depot, and Carol Atkins was behind the donations table with her sleeves rolled, running the operation like a field marshal in a Sunday blouse. Marge walked up, said, "Carol, from your daughter," and put the envelope in her hand. My mother smiled the hostess smile, Marge said, until she felt the shape of what was inside. And then, Marge told me, gleeful as a girl, she went the color of my good tablecloth. White, with a pattern of panic. My mother read the one line on the front. She looked up, and the first words out of Carol Atkins, in the middle of the fellowship hall, with half the hospitality committee in earshot. "We're not is my daughter all right. We're not. Where are they staying?" They were. What did she tell you? Marge, who is 71 and buried a husband and does not scare, looked my mother dead in the eye and said, "Nothing, Carol." She didn't have to. Family is whoever shows up with a casserole and no conditions, and I noticed it was me driving this envelope into town. Then she took her prescription bag and left my mother holding 18 years of brass. Marge finished the story, patted my hand, and squinted at me. "Your pulse is up, honey." It was, because a woman like my mother can survive almost anything except a question she can't control the answer to, and I knew, the counterattack was already loading. It arrived late that same night, headlights swinging up the farm road just as I came back from Marge's. The church van, a cardboard box with my daughter's name on it in my mother's beautiful cursive. "For Ellie, with love, Grandma." Delivered, mind you, not to us quietly, but through the church relief system, logged on the donations sheet, blessed in public. Dana called before the van even left the parking lot. Her mother had watched Carol pack that box at the depot table, narrating it for the room. "My granddaughter and my daughter were displaced, you know. We're doing all we can. All we can." I opened the box on my kitchen table while Ellie hovered, because an 8-year-old who has never once gotten a gift from her grandmother does not hover casually, and that alone should tell you everything. Inside, a winter coat, size 4T. Ellie wears a girl's 10. 2 summer dresses, wrong season, tags from a clearance rack 3 years old. A Bible storybook for preschoolers. A stuffed rabbit with a crushed ear, the kind of thing that sits in a donation pile, not a toy store. Not one item in that box would fit, warm, or interest the actual child whose name was on it, because the box was never for the child. It was for the donation sheet. It was a receipt, purchased in public, proving Carol Atkins had done all she could. Ellie lifted out the tiny coat, held it against herself, and looked at me with an expression I never want to see on her face again. Not hurt, worse than hurt, arithmetic. She was calculating her own size in her grandmother's imagination. She said, "Grandma thinks I'm still little. Quiet, factual, 8 years old." I packed the box back up with steady hands. The next morning, the ground moved again. Saturday, 6:40 in the morning, 3 days after my mother's doorstep. I was measuring coffee when the floor kicked. Sharper than the first one, meaner, a 5.1 the radio would say, centered east of town. Pine walls popped like knuckles. Ellie's rocks danced on the windowsill, and she was out of her room and into my arms before the shaking stopped, and I held her and counted seconds the way I count respirations. And then it was over, and the crickets started back up like nothing happened. Farm damage. One cracked window in Marge's mudroom, a shelf of preserves on the floor, Marge herself steady as a fence post. I checked her pulse anyway, both of us pretending that was for her benefit. Then the radio told the rest. The aftershock had thrown its weight east of Cedar Wells. Power out across the whole east side, chimneys down, crews dispatched to Linden, Hawthorne, Miller Road. Linden. I stood in my dry, lit, upright kitchen with the radio hissing, and my thumb found the bare place on my keyring where a brass key used to live, and rubbed it, once, like a phantom limb. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because this channel is nothing if I lie to you. Not satisfaction. You can cut a rope and still feel it snap somewhere down in your chest where the anchor used to be. 67 and 63, alone in a dark house with a cracked chimney and no daughter with a key anymore. I was still standing there when my phone lit up on the counter and buzzed itself half a turn sideways. The screen said, "Mom. First call, since we don't talk about that." I let it ring twice. Then I answered. I have heard my mother's telephone voice my whole life, bright, managed, every sentence wearing its Sunday clothes. The voice that came through that morning had been stripped to the studs. "Tori, your father fell." I was already moving for my work bag while she talked, because some part of me goes on shift automatically, and the story came out in pieces. The shaking, a chunk of chimney brick through the porch roof. Ray running for the hallway in the dark, the floor lamp, the fall. He'd caught the corner of the console table going down. There was blood. Head blood, she said. So much blood. And I told her scalps bleed like liars. That's their job. And heard her breath hitch at something almost like comfort. She'd called 911. Everyone had called 911. The aftershock had every ambulance in the county running priority calls, and a conscious 67-year-old with a scalp wound and a hurt wrist was hours down the list. The ER said watch him or wait. And then my mother, Carol Atkins, Empress of the Casserole Brigade, chairwoman of everything, said the sentence I'd been waiting 18 years to hear. In the last circumstances, I'd have chosen to hear it. I didn't know who else to call. There it was. Not I was wrong. Not come home. The truth by accident. When the lights go out, the person you call is the person you should have made room for. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and 18 years went through me in about 3 seconds. Doorsteps, one-chair dinners, a box of wrong-sized clothes. Then the shift nurse in me took the wheel. "Keep him still and keep him talking," I said. "I'm on my way." Marge took Ellie without being asked twice. "Go, we'll make pancakes. The child can supervise." And I was halfway down the garage stairs when Ellie called after me from the landing. Not scared. Steady, in that new voice she'd grown that week, my sentence handed back to me like a canteen before a march. "We don't beg for rooms, Mommy." 8 years old. She'd learned the lesson and she was checking that I still knew it. Go help, but come back whole. Some kids inherit money. Mine inherited a spine, and I spent the first mile of that drive deciding whether to be proud or heartbroken that she'd needed one so young. The 6 miles east were a tour of what the aftershock kept. Dark traffic lights swinging on their wires, a bearded man in a bathrobe directing traffic at 5th and Main with a coffee mug, doing a better job than the light ever did. Utility trucks staged in the grocery lot like cavalry. And the whole drive, I did what I do before a hard shift. I packed myself. Gauze, saline, gloves, blood pressure cuff. That's the bag. The other packing is invisible and matters more. I zipped the daughter away where she couldn't be reached, and I put on the nurse, because the nurse could walk into 214 Linden Court and do her job clean, and the daughter would stand in that hallway bleeding from wounds nobody could see or suture. One of them was useful to that house. Only one of them was safe in it. I turned onto Linden Court as the sun cleared the roof lines, and there it was at the end of the street. The house with no space for my daughter, standing crooked for the first time in its life, front door wide open. My father was on the hallway floor with a couch cushion under his head and a dish towel pressed to his scalp. The same towel, I'd swear, he'd been holding in that doorway 3 days before, finally given a job. My mother hovered over him with her hands doing that helpless bird thing, and the house around them was a stranger to me. No power. Drapes half down. A lightning bolt of plaster crack running up the stairwell wall. The smell of a refrigerator 2 hours into surrender. I knelt, gloved up, and went to work. And the work steadied all three of us, which is the secret nobody tells you about medicine. Scalp laceration, 4 centimeters, ragged but shallow. Bled like a crime scene, as scalps do, but the skull under it was sound. Pupils equal and reactive. He knew his name, the date, the president, and that he was embarrassed, which is actually a good neurological sign. Left wrist swollen, tender, likely a sprain, possibly a hairline, splint, ice, X-ray when the world calmed down. I cleaned and closed and wrapped, narrating everything in my flat clinical voice. This will be cold, look at my finger, squeeze my hand, and my parents obeyed me like schoolchildren. That's the thing I hadn't planned for, how the power in that house tipped the moment I walked in with gloves. 67 years old, my father lay still under my hands, and when I finished taping the dressing, he looked up at me with wet eyes and said, rough as gravel, "You came." And I heard the hallway go quiet, my mother behind me somewhere holding her breath, both of them waiting to see which one had shown up, the daughter or the nurse. I snapped the tape, checked his pupils one more time, and told the truth. I'm a nurse. This is what we do. His face did something complicated. And behind me, barely louder than the refrigerator, I heard my mother say, 2 hours ago, I didn't think anyone was coming at all. We got my father settled on the couch with his wrist splinted and elevated, and then my mother did the only thing Carol Atkins knows how to do with her hands when her world is on fire. She made tea. Gas stove, match, the good pot. But I watched her hands shake striking that match. 3 tries, and I said nothing, because some diagnoses you keep to yourself. The kitchen was dim and wrong. Fridge silent and weeping onto the linoleum. Casserole dishes stacked by the sink. Other people's. Delivered that morning, because the whole East Side was checking on the whole East Side. Her fortress was melting at room temperature, and she stood in the middle of it in yesterday's cardigan, and for a moment I saw something I'd never once seen at that address, a 63-year-old woman who did not know what to do. Then she found her old road. She set my tea down and said, brightly, horribly, "People have been asking about you at church, you know." Susan mentioned the shelter. "I hope you haven't been discussing family matters in—" And I just looked at her. That's all. I've stood at enough bedsides to know silence outpulls any argument ever made, so I let hers hang in that dark kitchen until the sentence heard itself, until family matters and shelter and a bleeding man on the couch all stood in the same room together, and her voice ran out of road, and her chin came down a centimeter. My mother, out of script. First time in 34 years. She turned back to the stove, and that's when the knock came. 3 warm raps. A voice through the screen door. Susan Pratt, holding candles in a casserole, looking straight down the hall at me, elbow deep in my father's care. Susan Pratt stood in that doorway maybe 90 seconds, and in small-town accounting, that's a full audit. She saw the splint I was adjusting. She saw the dressing on my father's head, my gloves, my work bag open on the coffee table. She saw my mother in yesterday's cardigan. And you could watch the ledger reconciling behind her kind eyes. The girls are fine, plenty of options, practically camping. Against the actual visible arithmetic of the daughter from the shelter cots kneeling in this dark house doing the work of an emergency room. She didn't say any of it. Churchwomen of a certain age conduct entire trials without an audible word. She set down the candles and the casserole, said, "Ray, you're in the best hands in this county," which was a verdict, and left. The screen door hadn't finished closing before my mother came apart at the one seam I should have predicted. "Not thank God your father's all right. Not what do we owe you." She pressed her fingers to her mouth and said, "Now the whole church will know we told you no." I set down the roll of tape, and my mother heard it, heard her own sentence out loud in the room, the way you sometimes only hear yourself through another person's silence. Her face went through fear, then something rarer. Recognition. "That's the part that scares you," I said. level, clinical. Okay. Just that. I wasn't there to operate on her conscience. If you've ever watched somebody worry about the neighbors before their own bleeding family, comment the word nerve below because you'll understand everything that happened after dark. And subscribe because what my mother carried down those stairs at 2 in the morning, I promise you cannot guess. The knock that mattered came in the late afternoon, except it wasn't a knock. It was a car idling at the curb too long, an old tan Buick, a woman in the driver's seat looking at the house the way you look at a dog that bit you decades ago. I watched her through the front window for a full minute before she got out. Silver braid, pressed slacks, 70 or close to it, and something in the architecture of her face that I knew because I'd seen it across the breakfast table my whole childhood. She came up the walk slow, and I stepped out onto the porch to meet her, and she looked at me and put a hand to her chest. "Lord," she said, "you stand just like my mother." That's how I met my aunt, Dinah Keller, 67, of Bakersfield, who heard about the aftershock on the radio and drove 2 hours to look at a house she had not stood inside since 1976, when she was 17 years old and 6 weeks pregnant, and her own mother put 2 suitcases on this porch, and the church called it strength. She told me the middle part in one flat sentence, the way you hand over something too heavy to unwrap slowly. 50 years. A whole erased woman, 400 miles of gone, and my mother had been 13, watching from that window. The same window I'd just been standing at. Dinah looked past me down the hall, where Carol had gone absolutely still with a teacup in her hand, and my aunt didn't step inside. She stayed on the porch, on the exact boards, I suppose, where the suitcases had been, and she said, quietly, to me, but for the whole house. 50 years ago there was no space for me either. Same doorway, different girl. Down the hall, porcelain clinked, a cup set down with 2 hands. I made my decision right there. Dad needs checks every 2 hours tonight, I said. I'm staying till morning, as his nurse. One night in that house, the night everything got said. Dinah left before supper. I've seen what I came to see, and it's not the chimney. And the house went down into its first dark night in 50 years of order. I did my father's checks at 8, at 10, at midnight. Pupils, grip, orientation, his big electrician's hand squeezing mine on command and holding on a half second past the clinical requirement every single time. At 2 in the morning, I was at the kitchen table by candlelight, charting his vitals in my notebook, when the stairs creaked and my mother came down in her robe, and she was carrying the envelope. My envelope. You'll need this more than I will. She sat across from me, laid it between us like evidence, and for a long time the only sound was the candle. Then she talked, and it did not come out managed. It came out like something lanced. She was 13 the night her sister left. She'd watched from the window on the stairs, the 2 suitcases, the porch light, Dinah's coat wrong for the weather. And on Sunday their mother walked into First Baptist with her chin high, and the congregation received her like a war widow. Strong woman, righteous woman, did what had to be done. They praised her, my mother said, staring at the candle. For 20 years I watched them praise her for it. I learned the rules like I learned scripture, Tori, I thought, and her voice did something I'd never heard it do. I thought if I kept the rules would keep me. I sat very still, the way you do when a patient finally tells you where it hurts. I understood my mother completely in that moment. Understanding is not the same as absolution, it's just a better diagnosis. Then my mother opened the envelope, took out the brass key, and did the thing I had been 18 years imagining and 3 days burying. She reached across her kitchen table, took my hand, and pressed the key into my palm. Pressed it, folded my fingers over it, held them shut with both her hands like a woman sealing a promise or a wound. Come home, she said, both of you. I didn't breathe. She kept going, urgent now, the words tumbling like they'd been stacked behind a door. Ellie could have the sewing room. No, Ellie could have my old room, the big one, with the window. She'd already talked to my father before the fall. the night the church saw the shelter list. Ray had wanted to drive out that same evening. She was the one who'd said wait. "The house is half yours anyway," she said. "It was always going to be. Half of everything." And from the dark hallway behind us, my father's voice, thick and certain, first full sentence he'd volunteered in 3 days. "She means it, Tori. Come home. Understand what was in my hand. Not just brass. The room with the window. Pancake mornings. My daughter. Finally. On the inside of that door. The exact dream I had been paying installments on for 8 years. Delivered whole, warm, tonight. Every version of me that ever climbed their ladder or filled their pill organizer stood up at once inside my chest and reached. My fingers were curled around that key so hard the teeth bit my palm. And then, out of nowhere, or out of everywhere, I heard my daughter's voice on the garage stairs. "We don't beg for rooms, Mommy." There was one question left. I asked it. I opened my hand so the key lay flat on my palm, between the three of us, and I looked at my mother in the candlelight, and I asked her the only question that had ever mattered, quiet as a pulse check. "If the earthquake hadn't cracked your chimney, Mom, if the church hadn't seen us on those cots, would Ellie have a room in this house tonight?" The candle ticked. The refrigerator dripped into its pan. My father, on the couch, stopped breathing audibly, and my mother opened her mouth, and I watched her. I want you to understand. I watched her try. She was searching for the yes. She wanted the yes. Her whole face reached for the yes the way a falling woman reaches for a railing. And she could not find it, because we were sitting at a truth table at 2 a.m. by candlelight. And Carol Atkins does not lie in front of witnesses she can't manage, and there were 3 of them. Her husband, her daughter, and herself. The silence went 1 second past survivable, then another. Her eyes filled and her chin came down, and that was the answer. The honest, awful, complete answer. The only honest thing she'd given me since the nursery glass, 34 years of politeness ago. No. Without the disaster? No. Without the audience? No. The offer in my hand was real. The room, the deed, the pancakes, all of it real. And it had been purchased at 6:40 a.m. 3 days ago by a seismic event, and countersigned by a church shelter list, and notarized by a chimney. And here's what I felt, and I'll tell you the truth, because you've stayed with me this long. Relief. Terrible, clean relief. Because for 18 years I'd believed there was a price I hadn't found yet. Some final chore that unlocked that house. And there had never been a price. There was only weather. I closed my hand around the key one last time, feeling every year of it, and then I set it down on the table between the 2 teacups. "Here's what I can give you," I said, and my voice came out the way it does over a hospital bed, low even, load-bearing. "I'll stay till morning. I'll check Dad every 2 hours. When you're sick, I'll come. When the pipes freeze, call me. That's the daughter you raised. She doesn't quit people." My mother's hands were flat on the table, bracketing the key, not touching it. But my daughter is 8 years old, and she has spent her whole life watching this family decide she's a condition to be managed. She will never sleep in a house where she was a condition. Not this one. Not anyone's. I nodded at the key on the wood. "So no, Mom. We're not coming home. We are home." Nobody moved. And I'm going to be straight with you about the cost. Because this channel doesn't sell fairy tales. Saying it out loud hurt worse than the doorstep had. On the doorstep she'd taken something from me. At that table I gave it up myself. The room with the window, the half of everything. The 8-year dream, returned to sender with my own steady hands. And there is no version of that which doesn't cost. Somewhere down the family grapevine I knew, this night would be retold until I was the daughter who abandoned her injured father over a grudge, and I would not be correcting the record, because correcting records is just begging with paperwork. My mother looked at the key, then at me, and asked, barely a whisper, "Is this because of the shelter? The church knowing?" She still couldn't see it. I picked up my charting notebook. "It's because you never asked her size, Mom. 8 years. You never once asked her size." She started to cry then. My mother, who did not cry at her own mother's funeral, who has hosted grief like a luncheon her whole life. And it wasn't pretty crying. It was the other kind, the kind that comes up from storage. And I want to be honest about this part too. I did not go around the table and hold her. Maybe you think I should have. But I'd spent 18 years supplying the comfort in that house, and this grief was hers to sit in, and the kindest thing I could do, the only clean thing, was not rescue her from the first honest weather of her life. She said, into her hands, "There was never enough space. Your grandmother, the church, this town. You don't know what it takes, Tori, to keep a family looking right." And there it was, the whole disease in one sentence, and I gave her back the cure in one. "You never ran out of space, Mom. You ran out of nerve." She flinched like I'd touched a wound, because I had. Then the kitchen timer in my head went off. 2 a.m. checks. And I did the only sermon I know. I got up, walked to the couch, and shined my penlight in my father's eyes. Pupils equal. Grip strong. He held onto my hand in the dark, and he said so quietly it was almost just breath. I should have said something. 8 years ago. On that porch 3 days ago. Every Sunday in between. I clicked the light off. "Yes," I said. "You should have." He nodded, and didn't let go of my hand, and I let him not let go. Forgiveness isn't free, but it does take a down payment. I left at first light. Before I went, I sat at the kitchen table one last time and wrote out a care sheet in my block print. Wound care, splint schedule, warning signs, when to force the ER trip whether he liked it or not. And at the bottom, my cell number. And under my cell number, for emergencies. Real ones. My mother stood at the counter watching me tape it to the refrigerator, her eyes swollen, her cardigan buttoned wrong, one button off, and I did not fix it. And if you've followed this story, you know exactly how much restraint that took. The key stayed on the table, right where I'd set it down, between the teacups, in the ring of candle wax. My mother wouldn't put it back in the drawer, because putting it away was admitting. My father couldn't pick it up, because picking it up was deciding. So it just lay there in the gray morning light, a house key belonging to no one, in a 4-bedroom house with 2 people, and no space. And I looked at it from the doorway and thought, 3 days. 3 days ago there was no space for an 8-year-old girl. Now the emptiest address in Cedar Wells has a spare room, a spare deed, and a spare key, and nobody in it young enough to fill any of them. I drove home to the farm with the sun coming up in my mirrors. 6 weeks now. FEMA came through with rental assistance. I filed the paperwork the way I chart, complete and on time. And it covers a fair piece of the farm rent, which Marge grumbles about taking and takes. Ellie's school reopened after 2 weeks of inspections. She rides a bus now that picks up at the end of a farm road, and she has told every child on it that she lives on a ranch. Population 2 horses, which is 100% false, and I have declined to correct it. My father's wrist came out of the splint at 5 weeks. I know because he's driven out here twice, both times with the toolbox, no phone call first. First visit, he sat in the truck in the yard for 10 full minutes, and Marge and I watched him through the kitchen window like 2 herons watching a fish decide. Then he got out, found the sagging gate on the chicken run, and rebuilt it without asking anybody, and drank 1 glass of lemonade standing up, and said, "Well," and left. Second visit, he fixed the porch light and let Ellie hand him the screwdrivers, and I heard him tell her the names of all of them. Flathead, Phillips, the Little Torques, an electrician's catechism, and my daughter recited them back like state capitals. He hasn't said the word sorry. He's 67. The word may not survive the trip up. But tools are a language, and he is speaking it as fast as his hands allow. My mother has not come. Church sources report she resigned nothing, admitted nothing, chairs everything. Same cardigan armor. Except Dana says that at the October potluck, when someone started a sentence about my situation, Carol Atkins left the table to refill a pitcher that was full. Sunday dinners happen at the farm now. It isn't a table anyone planned. It accreted, the way real families do. Marge at the head, because it's her farmhouse and her pot roast. Jen and her husband when their shifts allow. Ellie doing homework between the serving bowls, rocks arranged by the napkins, explaining sedimentary versus igneous to anyone slow enough to get caught. And one Sunday a month, driving up from Bakersfield with a pie and a seamstress's posture. Dinah. My aunt and I don't do speeches. She hems Ellie's school pants. I check her blood pressure. Two women the same doorway spat out, 50 years apart, passing the butter. Marge looked down that table one night and delivered the verdict like she was reading a meter. Family is whoever shows up with a casserole and no conditions. Nobody argued. Then, the first cold Saturday of November, Ellie came pounding up the garage stairs holding a mason jar like it was a moon rock. Someone had left a box on the bottom step. No note. No knock. We'd have heard a knock. Inside, 6 jars of home-canned peaches, and on each lid, in a beautiful, careful, terrified cursive I have known my whole life, for Ellie, not for Tori and Ellie, for Ellie. 8 years late and small enough to fit on a jar lid. I'm sorry spelled the only way my mother's generation was ever taught to spell it. I stood on the landing a long time with a jar in my hand. Then I gave it to my daughter and let her decide, because that's the whole point of everything, isn't it? Ellie studied the lid, studied me. Then she opened the jar at Sunday dinner and passed it around the whole table, first to Dinah. Grandma makes good peaches, she announced. And that was all. And that was everything. We don't beg for rooms. We build them. We did. And here's the one thing I'd carve over every door I own. I spent 18 years trying to earn a place in a house that measured love by what the neighbors could see. And it took an earthquake to teach me that home was never the place with space for you. It's the place where your child is never a condition. That's my story. One earthquake, one key, returned twice. And a farmhouse table with room for everyone who shows up without conditions. If someone ever made your child feel like a footnote in their family, you're not alone. And you're not wrong for walking. Share this video with somebody who needs the reminder today. Drop a comment telling me what you built after somebody told you there was no space. Hit subscribe if this one landed, and I'll see you in the next one.